Hello, my name is Jacob Abbott, and today I will be presenting work that I did with Dr. Samir Patil from Indiana University regarding how mandatory second factor affects the authentication user experience. Two-factor authentication is becoming a commonly used method to improve security for organizations, so access is not limited to being protected by a single password. Many times, two-factor authentication is implemented in a way similar to this following example. Users are asked for their username and password, as with most standard websites. Once those are verified, a second prompt is presented requesting how someone would like to authenticate with a second factor. For this example, we'll choose to have a push notification sent to our phone. Finally, we can choose to approve the authentication attempt and continue on to the system we were accessing. While Indiana University announced they would be implementing two-factor authentication in a phased rollout over 3 periods, we thought it would be an opportune time to investigate how two-factor authentication might affect the user experience. Looking at the university's planned phases, the process is broken up as follows. First, two-factor authentication would be mandatory only for select highly sensitive systems for staff, faculty, and student employees, such as systems accessing health records, financial records, or student information. The second phase would be mandating two-factor authentication for all systems for employees. Finally, the third phase would require two-factor authentication for all systems for employees and students, so everyone associated with the university. The phased approach allowed us to gather information over an extended period of time to explore the following research questions. What are the differences in the user experience in different modes of two-factor authentication implementation? What are user preferences for 2FA use? And what implementation options for two-factor authentication could balance security benefits and user experience challenges? So we collected 3 types of data regarding the use of two-factor authentication and attitudes surrounding it. To this, we performed a survey during each stage of the two-factor authentication rollout. Additionally, we worked with the university's IT office to gather chat logs with people discussing two-factor authentication with the university's online help desk. And finally, we gained access to authentication log data from the IT office to investigate how the system was used in practice beyond the self-reported behavior of the survey respondents. Next, I'll proceed in presenting findings pulled from each of these data before synthesizing our recommendations and implications as a whole. In the survey, we asked questions focused on participants' practices and preferences of using 2FA, what security measures they used on their own mobile devices, the task load required when using two-factor authentication, which was based from NASA's Task Load Index, and some technical expertise questions to gauge their familiarity with computer security, and finally, demographics to better understand their relationship with the university. Responses were broken up into 3 groups. 44 responses were from the single factor group, for those who were not required to use two-factor authentication, 74 in select systems for those who used two-factor authentication only for the highly sensitive systems, and 447 in the all systems group for those who had used two-factor authentication for accessing any university system. The all systems group had the largest response rate as the university's policies changed over time and made use of two-factor authentication for all systems mandatory for everyone. For the remainder of the talk, the select systems group will be referred to as 2FA select, and the all systems group will be called 2FA all. So in our findings, we looked at the survey responses. We found no significant differences between the single factor and 2FA select groups responses for the task load of authenticating. However, compared to the single factor group, those in the 2FA all group reported statistically significantly higher levels of frustration when authenticating with a p=0.037 value. They also reported statistically significantly lower levels of overall satisfaction with the authentication user experience, with a p-value of 0.016. While these were statistically significant, the small effect size suggests that differences in single interactions may not be drastic, but could create a larger impact over time. In regards to what method people most often use as their second factor, the majority of respondents reported using push notifications as their main choice for use as a second factor, followed by phone calls, physical tokens, SMS messages, and lastly, one-time passwords generated by an app. Looking at early responses to some open-ended questions we asked, we found that responses were often expressing negative views regarding the use of 2FA. To investigate a bit further, we added some questions regarding what systems individuals might find useful to have protected by two-factor authentication. We asked for a range of different systems, from those requiring data protection by law down to classifieds, or even the suggestion of no two-factor authentication for any system. We found that the majority of respondents were happy to have two-factor authentication protect highly sensitive systems such as those protecting financial, health, and student records, while over 1 in 4 said they would rather have two-factor authentication for all systems. And meanwhile, only 8% said they did not want two-factor authentication at all for any system. 1,600 chat logs were qualitatively coded by myself and 2 other students, and we achieved a high level of intercoder agreement with a Cohen's kappa of 0.901. Themes were pulled into 2 categories: emotions and topics of conversation. We found that the most observed emotional responses in the chat logs was confusion at 73%, with people being confused as to varying aspects of two-factor authentication. Meanwhile, we only saw frustration in 4% of the conversations. We found that 81% of conversations were specifically in regards to questions about setting up two-factor authentication for an account. 28% asked about adding a device in the setup process or adding a new device afterwards. 16% asked questions about what to do and how they could authenticate when their device was missing, such as if they had left their phone at home or had bought a new phone and the old one was no longer in their possession. 15% of discussions asked about the use and availability of physical tokens for access, while 6% asked about the steps required to authenticate with remote access through VPN. Authentication logs were cleared of identifying data before analysis and spanned from December 2016 to April 2019. As shown in the figure, you can see the number of daily authentications started below 50,000 authentications per day and hit a peak of just under 450,000 authentications in a day. The orange arrow pointing to February of 2017 indicates the start of the second phase that required all employees to use two-factor authentication for all systems, resulting in a large growth in the number of daily authentication requests. The beginning of two-factor authentication being required for everyone for all systems is highlighted by the green arrow pointing to November of 2017. This period had a sharp growth before a drop in activity over the winter break. There was a sharp rise in February of 2018 for a few days, but that is an anomaly due to external system issues. In the remaining time period, it can be observed that activity drops during the summer months and the time frame around Christmas and New Year's, while the highest spikes of activity coincide with the beginning of each semester in August and January. Please note that the graph shows the total number of authentication attempts each day, with color coding purple for successful authentications and orange for failed authentication attempts. There additionally is a small gap in March of 2017 where a coding error did not collect logs for a period of 2 weeks. When we take a look at the rate of successes and failures over time, as shown in the current graph, we can see that the average rate of failed authentication attempts is roughly 1 in 10. This is a fairly high percentage, and so we looked into what reasons might be given for these unsuccessful attempts. In the authentication logs, whenever a failed attempt was recorded, the system also logged an automated reason for the failure. Here we show the top 5 reasons that were applied to the failed authentication attempts logged. Of all observed failures, 61% were marked as user canceled and still flagged as a failed authentication attempt. Therefore, the majority of failures may have been due to users choosing not to authenticate rather than failed attempts due to errors. The second highest reported reason for failure was no response, which was paired with push notifications and phone calls, implying the user likely did not interact with their phone before the time frame ended. 11% of failures were attributed to invalid passcodes being entered from physical tokens, SMS messages, and one-time passwords generated from applications. 2% of failures were attributed to no keys pressed, which was only applied to phone calls. It may be that the failures were attributed to the system counting voicemail triggering as a response to the phone call received, but no keys pressed to continue on. Finally, at 1%, accounts being locked out for too many failed attempts made up the fifth largest reason for failed authentication attempts. The most important goal behind two-factor authentication implementation is protecting systems with sensitive information. Limiting two-factor authentication to only select highly sensitive systems that handle sensitive information should offer the protections organizations seek without creating an undue burden on users. Responses of our participants suggest that limiting the extra security requirements of two-factor authentication to critical systems and letting users opt into two-factor authentication for other systems might provide elevated security and reduce user burden at the same time. In fact, our findings show that users would likely welcome the added protection despite the small increase in authentication burden. Take this quote from a participant as an example. Limiting two-factor authentication requirements to highly sensitive systems that both organizations and general users deem worth the additional effort may be a potential compromise between additional security and lowered user experience. Quantifying the organizational value of 2FA is difficult, as it would require precise quantifications of security benefits that are often difficult or even potentially impossible to determine. Future work could further incorporate economic analyses that analyze the collective productivity losses and emotional impact of mandatory two-factor authentication in relation to the realized organizational security gains. Thank you very much for your attention. Further details are available in the paper and supplementary materials.